Too slow, huh? I'll show you who's too slow, asshole. Hey guys, you like Warframe? I got you something special today. Let's be completely honest with ourselves for a second. Is anyone else sick of the meta? Like, I feel like all anyone ever uses nowadays is the Torrid. Whatever happened to options? What about variety? But never fear, I know why you're here. We're like kindred souls, two parts of the same. You long for something different, something new. I know that's what I'm here for, so I thought I'd share with you all a little something. I've been working hard, toiling, day in and day out, just for you. I have stayed the path to becoming the Ivara Master, and by the end of our little session here, you'll be an Ivara Master too. So why should you play Ivara? Well, for starters, isn't she just cute? But I'd say the best thing about Ivara is the numbers. What's that? You don't know what I'm talking about?
Behold!
Let's talk about abilities. Ivara's first ability is Quiver, aka Dashwire, because that's all you're going to be using. This is a heavily underrated ability. Dashwire not only lets you create your own ground to stand on, but gives you an absurd critical multiplier if you use it correctly. The more I play this Warframe, the more fun I have just trying to find weird spots to put up a Dashwire. Placing them down can be a little finicky, so let me give you a quick lesson. Dashwire really wants you to use it with your back against a wall. The further you are from a wall, the less consistent Dashwire feels for some reason. I think this is important to keep in mind in case you're setting up in a room that doesn't have a clear and obvious Dashwire spot. Invisible or not, setting up too close to the ground is a lot riskier than you think. Mainly due to 3 different enemy types. Nullifiers, Blitz Eximus, and whatever those ones like the electric orb are called, I can't be bothered to look it up. Out of the 3, the Shock Eximus seems to have the longest reach, so if you set up out of their range, you should be good to go. In case you actually wanted my opinion on the other
Quiver.
arrows, Sleep is fine, you'll use it sometimes. Cloak exists, you might use it. Noise doesn't exist, you'll never use that. I think it's very unnecessary that the Warframe with Prowl, arguably one of the best stealth abilities in the game, needs 3 other stealth abilities attached to one ability, but I digress. Okay, let's talk about Navigator. This is the best ability in the game. Like, fuck you. If you disagree, fuck you. All of you people building Ivara around Artemis Bow, my condolences, I'm so sorry. There's another way. Please, there's another way. For those of you who don't know how Navigator works, you're about to fucking learn. You're about to be kissing my feet and sucking my toes. That's how indebted to me you'll feel once you get your hands on this build. Anyways, Navigator. This ability lets you take control of a projectile fired by your weapon and just kind of pilot it wherever you feel like. The longer you pilot it, the higher the damage multiplier gets, and it gets really high. A lot of people tend to assume Navigator's bad because I feel like we've all used it for the first time with a projectile weapon and experienced how much nothing it does with just any random weapon, but there are a few weapons that really just push this ability to the limit. You're gonna have to stay tuned for those though. Please stay tuned, trust me, it's worth it. I'm not going to be talking about Navigator too much yet, because we're going to be diving really deep into the specifics later. So for now, let's just move on to Prowl. Prowl is really strong invisibility, but with a cost. Your movement speed is heavily impacted while it's active. Wouldn't it just be cool if Ivara could be really effective without moving at all? That'd be cool. I think that'd be cool. Do you? Yeah, I think it'd be cool. Oh, and would you look at that? It gives you a headshot multiplier. Another damage multiplier. Man, Ivara sure has a lot of those, doesn't she? Get ready, guys, because I've got multiple builds lined up for you today.
Spoiled little piggies, aren't you?
The first build I'll be talking about is a Navigator build involving the Grimoire, aka
Evil Orb.
Let's start with our good old Ivara Prime. There's actually 2 different variants of this build depending on your preference, but I'll get into that in a minute. The first build is a pretty simple, just efficiency strength build. Navigator Ivara has almost no need for range, and very little need for duration. You only want as much duration as you can get without affecting your channeled ability efficiency. I'd say the most important part of this build are the arcanes. With the 1999 update, we were given the new Arcane Crepuscular. This thing's kinda fucked up. 3 times final crit multiplier? That's insane. Alongside this, we need our Molt Augmented. If you don't have this arcane, please get it. Unless I'm mistaken, this is the highest power strength boost Ivara can get from an arcane. And since Ivara's abilities all have damage multipliers pretty much, power strength has a gigantic ripple effect throughout her entire kit. As for the subsume, you're going to want to put Empower over Artemis Bow. As much as I wish Artemis Bow actually worked with Navigator, it does nothing. In the Exilus slot, I have Prime Sure-Footed. This mod isn't entirely necessary, I hate Knockdown. Knockdown in endgame is just death. You die, that's it. With how important this mod is, I don't think it should be a login reward, but that's not relevant. If you don't have this, maybe just throw on that Drift mod for power strength. Your Archon shards should all be Topaz. I bet you never fucking made one of those before. Unless you're like a Iorelli or a Mesa player. And you want to pick the secondary crit chance on Heat Kill. Obviously for your secondary, you're picking the Grimoire. Your primary and melee don't really matter that much, but your companion really matters. Because you're bringing the strongest companion in the game, the Hound. You want to use the classic status spreading build with as many statuses as possible, but most importantly heat damage. This will help you build up your Topaz shard stacks without really having to go out of your way for it. However, if you have a good work ethic, and you just want more damage in the long run, you could bring the Adarza Kavat. You'll just have to build up those Topaz stacks yourself, so make sure you bring a good heat primary. For your focus tree, you're definitely going to want Matter Eye, and you need to make sure you have the skill Sling Strength maxed out. This skill is a pretty important part of the gameplay loop of Navigator Ivara, so for all of the Navigator builds I talk about, just assume you bring Sling Strength. Okay, book time! So generally how you build a weapon around Navigator is pretty consistent. You're just going to want to build for raw damage, crit chance, crit damage, and whatever utility you need. So my Grimoire build that I use is just that. Crit chance, crit damage, raw damage with corrosive. I personally use a Riven mod. You don't really need a Riven mod to reach the insane damage numbers that this thing can reach, but it's really convenient because you can get projectile speed. My problem with pistols, I'm about to go on a rant. Why is lethal momentum so shit? This is kind of a thing with pistol mods in general, but some pistol mods feel nerfed for no reason when compared to their primary equivalents. I guess they're rifle variants, rather. Shotgun mods are even worse, actually. But lethal momentum, 40% projectile speed. The primary version is 60%. Why can't we have 60% projectile speed? I wouldn't need to recommend a Riven if it was just a little better. But it's just a little bit too low to the point where it feels a little bit sluggish. Which isn't to say that the build isn't as fun without a Riven. It's still a really fantastic build. It still hits fucking damage cap. But yeah, it's just an annoyance of mine. Anyways, the last thing you might be wondering about for this build is this mod right here. This is another mod that's optional, but it's very, very strong. It's Vohm Invocation. With Navigator, you're very consistently going to be getting the 60% power strength boost. And the great thing about Ivara with this mod is that all of her abilities snapshot power strength at the time of use. This also applies to Artemis Bow, so if you wanted to do an Artemis Bow build, you could honestly bring the Grimoire as a secondary, but I feel like everyone knows this, that's obvious. The most important part of the Grimoire build, though, is Secondary Surge. This arcane fucking sucks, but you actually have a use for it here. The reason this arcane is perfect for this build is because you're only gonna be shooting one shot, and you're gonna be shooting that shot after you use a bunch of abilities. No other arcane boosts your damage output like Secondary Surge does. So make sure you have at least a rank 3 one. So now that you have the build, how do you actually play Navigator Ivara? You're gonna want to use your abilities in a certain rotation. First, dash twice for Sling Strength. Then you empower, prowl, empower again, then you set up a dash wire, empower again, Navigator, make sure you're on the dash wire, and then shoot your projectile. With how this build works, you're going to be gaining power strength more and more as the mission goes on. So when you reach full Molt Augmented stats, I recommend setting up a new dash wire, and to do it right after you get done using Navigator to kill a bunch of enemies with the orb. This way, you'll have a big power strength boost from Vohm Invocation. I don't know if I'm allowed to say kill on YouTube anymore, but I think I'd rather die than say the word unalive, so I'm gonna keep saying it. You might say I'd rather unalive. Anyways, with that you should have everything you need to make this build effective. This is actually the build that I showed off in the beginning that was getting negative damage cap, so yeah, it's pretty fucking decent. I mentioned a variant build earlier, so I'm going to tell you about that now. It's mostly the same, aside from a couple of key changes. On the Ivara build, you're going to want to replace Streamline with Blind Rage. Then on the Grimoire build, you're going to want to get rid of Vom Invocation and replace it with Netra Invocation. I'm not sure if it works the same way with most other channeled abilities, but when you gain efficiency through Netra Invocation, the energy drain of Navigator actually slows down. Now, Navigator actually consumes more energy the longer you use it, and an interesting interaction between Netra Invocation and Navigator is that the faster you build up your Netra stacks with the Grimoire, the more it reduces your energy drain. This makes this alternate build a higher damage output, but also higher risk and higher energy consumption build. If you don't start hitting enemies quick, your energy drain is terribly impacted. And with that, you have both Evil Orb builds. But why should you use this over the other options? What are the positives and what are the negatives? Positives, the orb does a lot of damage. How often do you see negative fucking damage cap? This shit is good. Use it. Play Ivara, please. Now, what are the downsides? Nullifiers, exterminate missions. I think that's it. In any mission where you have the luxury of being able to stay in the confines of a couple of rooms, you're going to have the most damage on your team easily, and very likely the most kills as well. One of my favorite things with this build is looking at the results screen at the end of a mission and seeing myself have 99% damage and the rest of my team having 0%. It's very satisfying to me. Oh, actually, you know what? Another weakness? This is for Navigator Ivara in general. Doors. I hate doors. Playing Ivara has made me hate doors so much. Later on, I'm gonna kind of spitball some rework ideas for Ivara, and I've got some choice words for fucking doors, okay? Doors, fuck doors. I hate doors. That's why the whole Vania tile set absolutely just makes me spew all the best kinds of fluids. There's not a single door in sight. There's nothing better. Out here cranking my shit to Hulvania. Anyways, next build. Let's talk about the Zenistar, aka
Evil Sword.
I think it's about time people pay the Zenistar its due. This thing was hard meta back in the day, and honestly, it's still really good. Like, it's great in Navigator, but even Navigator aside, it's a fantastic melee weapon. The Ivara build is going to look mostly the same, aside from a couple of key differences. Firstly, we will actually be using Piercing Navigator this time, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Secondly, we're going to be running purple Archon shards with critical damage. That's right, we're building the Zenistar for crit. That 10% crit ain't a shower, but it's definitely a grower. Now let me ask you something. How do you think I'm going to build the Zenistar? What damage type do you think is the best? If you said Blast, I'm sorry. You're wrong. No. Blast is not enough. We need something great. Something powerful. Something incredible. Gassy, even.
This weapon needs a hero!
That's right, we're building the Zenistar incredibly gassy. I can go on and on about how underrated gas influence is, but I'm just gonna show you how good it is instead. Let's see your fucking blast damage do that, huh? You think you're so good? You think you're so strong? You think your blast damage is so fucking good, huh? Yeah, I'll show you. I'll fucking show you. When asked whether I prefer gas or blast damage, what I always say is, why kill a room full of enemies when you can kill a room full of enemies for the next fucking minute? And boy, does the Zeni kill rooms full of enemies. This build is the easiest solo survival you will ever experience. You just kind of sit there and things die. That being said, I wouldn't recommend staying too still. One of my favorite things about the Zenistar gameplay loop is trying to make use out of Piercing Navigator. I don't know what it is, but I feel like Piercing Navigator on melee weapons is bugged in the best way possible. Every time you bounce your stupid little UFO disc off someone's head, you gain a supposed 10% critical chance. That's fucking bullshit. That is not 10% chance. I'm getting red crits. I have a base 10% multiplier and I'm getting red crits. That's not 10% more each stack. Even when you have all of your piercing navigator stacks, I still recommend bouncing into enemies because Prowl actually boosts your headshot damage of the disc itself. You can get some pretty impressive numbers off of the disc alone. If an enemy's not dying, just fucking bonk him in the head. One of the great things about Navigator in the Zenistar is that Navigator overrides the Zenistar's timer. A lot of weapons would be good with Navigator if their projectile just didn't expire when it felt like it. But the Zenistar, although it does have an expiration timer, it just doesn't expire. It also breaks nullifier bubbles. I mean, so far this sounds like the perfect option, right? Well, I hate to break it to you, there are a few downsides. Firstly, the Zenistar does not have limited time in Navigator, but it does have limited range, and that can get really annoying in public missions. Second, Zada's Whisper. This is something that applies to every Navigator build except for the Grimoire. If someone on your team is running Zada's Whisper, you just can't play the game. Void procs just eat the Zenistar disc. And it's not like the disc has to even touch them. If your Flame AoE touches that Void proc, you're gone. You're kicked out of Navigator. And lastly, it doesn't hit damage cap. It's basically useless. I don't care how well it nukes. I don't care how many enemies it kills. If I don't get that funny negative number, what's the point, man? Anyways, fun fact, I discovered a tech where you can make it sit perfectly still in Navigator, and as long as you have energy, it won't run out of timer. And even then, if you go grab more energy and re-enter Navigator, it still won't run out of timer. So you can just kind of sit there with the disc spinning, nuking enemies constantly, and just kind of have an AFK survival mission. You can get like 4 minutes of scrolling your phone or whacking off or something. So, yeah, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. You're going to have to figure that out yourself. Sorry. I'm gatekeeping this. I'll tell you about it, but I won't tell you how to do it. It's not even difficult. You'll get it. Don't worry. You might do it on accident. Like, if they nerf this, it's your fault. Any Wukong mains watching this just don their fucking lab coats. Anyways, here's the last Navigator build. Actually, I also have an alternate Zenistar build if you want to maximize your damage. Get rid of Galvanized Reflex, replace it with Sacrificial Steel. Equip the Rauta. Before you shoot off your Zenistar every time, just load some fucker up with a bunch of Rauta bullets. Make sure you run Steel Charge instead of Worthy Steel. This build isn't as brainless as the normal Zenistar build, but it's a pretty considerable damage up, so I do recommend it. The last build we're going to talk about is our most beginner-friendly build. It involves the Arca Plasmor, aka
Evil Gun.
It doesn't have as much of a ring to it. Anyways, I'm going to spend the least amount of time on this one because, number one, it's the simplest build, and two, I need to get this fucking video out. Ivara build is basically identical to the melee build, except instead of, Ready Steel or True Steel, you're going to run Shotgun Amp. I hope you like Silver Grove! But also, if you don't have Shotgun Amp, just run whatever. For shards, ideally purple with electricity, but that's really only if you want to maximize the damage output of this specific Navigator build, which, if you're at the point where you're getting consistent Archon shards, I'd recommend moving to one of the other builds. As for the Plasmor build, here you go. Let me just get that out of there. The Plasmor's still a good option and definitely the easiest to obtain. It's just probably the worst build I'm going to be showing so far, mainly because one thing the Plasmor lacks that the Zenistar and the Orb has is just sort of the way those two weapons function. They're a constantly damaging AoE, meanwhile the Plasmor, you kind of have to run through the enemy, turn around, run through them again. So if you miss the one shot, it's going to be kind of more difficult to take the enemy out. Aside from that, certain enemies that just delete projectiles, certain enemies with shields, certain enemies with weak points, the Plasmor's just not the right pick. That's not to say it's never the best pick, though. I'm sure there are more examples than this, but at the time of recording this video, 1999 just came out recently, and I'd say the Plasmor is pretty good with Navigator for taking out the tank boss. I don't want to badmouth this build too much. Yes, it's my least favorite Navigator build, but it's still very worth doing, and if you're a newer player trying to get into using Ivara, I do very much recommend this build until you can get the Grimoire. That's kind of all I have to say about the Plasmor, though. And if you were expecting any kind of Artemis Bow build, I guess just use this Ivara build for Artemis Bow and don't subsume it off. There are a million Artemis Bow build videos though, don't come here for that. Some notes before I go on to the next segment. Recently my friend brought to my attention the Mandanel. Now you can't navigate this weapon itself, but it does have a pretty fun synergy with Navigator. So if you don't know how the Mandanel works, When you use the charge shot, it leaves behind this sort of radiation cloud. When you shoot through said cloud, you gain a pretty massive stat boost. I'm not going to read all of the different stats to you, I'll just put them up on screen, but you get a huge stat boost. So if you can just get a couple of shots out and then fly your little navigator projectile through that beam, you're going to have a massive boost in damage. I know at that point it's a lot of setup, but if you want to hit huge numbers, it's completely unnecessary. You're going to kill everything without it. But if you just want to hit big numbers for fun, go ahead and use it. Anyways, moving on. So this is a section on what I'd like to call dud weapons. By my own definition, a dud weapon is a weapon that you might think would work in Navigator, but ends up having a few downsides that completely hold it back from being viable. The first weapons I'm going to talk about might be a little controversial, because I do know a few Navigator users who use these weapons, but I think they're not quite as good as the weapons that I suggested. Firstly, the Nadaruk and the Sinta. These weapons are so close to being perfect in Navigator, but they have one huge downside. But before I answer that, what makes a weapon good in Navigator? I think the properties that make a weapon good for Navigator are, firstly, infinite punch through. This one is a must. Secondly, tolerable projectile speed. If it's way too fast or unbearably slow, it's not worth using. And third, a stat that I think is very important, but people don't really realize its worth, the ability to hit the same enemy multiple times. I'd say most projectile weapons in the game have a certain problem. After they hit an enemy, something in the code makes them unable to hit that same enemy again. The reason the orb and the zenistar are so good is because they're kind of different from most projectiles, where you don't really have to hit an enemy dead on to do damage with them. And one of the unique features of the plasmor that makes it work is that it can hit the same enemy multiple times. That's why it's so good on mag. This is where the Nadaruk and the Sinta fall short. They can't hit the same enemy multiple times. This becomes a problem when you're up against certain enemies that are too tanky to be one-shot, or have some kind of gating mechanic like arbitration drones. In this case, to kill that enemy, you're going to have to back out of Navigator, set up again, shoot another shot, and then hit them again. But then what if you don't kill them again? It just becomes a hassle. You lose the nuking capabilities of Navigator. Now, out of all the weapons on the duds list, the Nadaruk is somewhat usable. If you wanted to use this, I would just say revert to my primary build for the most part, replace the shotgun amp with rifle amp, but it's going to have some quality of life issues, and it's going to be very faction dependent. You'll struggle against Corpus and Corrupted, and arbitrations just aren't an option. Next, we talk about glaives. Glaives are an interesting bunch of weapons with Navigator. Some people have tried to make glaives work with Navigator. The playstyle ends up a lot different. It's more of a just kind of float around until your damage multiplier builds up and then detonate kind of playstyle. Now for me, I can respect wanting to get big numbers. That's why I love Grimoire IVARA so much, but this playstyle is just not that fun. This is more a to each their own thing. In terms of efficiency, I don't see why you wouldn't just throw a glaive normally. I have tested glaives in my sort of normal stay in Navigator for about a minute build, but they're really finicky. For some of them, it does seem like Piercing Navigator kind of gives them infinite punch through, but only kind of. They do share the wacky sort of heavy attack scaling that Piercing Navigator gets on the zenistar, but if you want to use glaives, I feel like there are better Warframes for glaives. Don't let me stop you though, I want more people to play IVARA. Even if it's a playstyle I don't like, if I see an IVARA on my squad, I'm happy. I just don't really consider it a, quote, Navigator build by my own personal definition, that being staying in Navigator as long as possible. After the glaives, let's talk about explosive weapons. So these are kind of the same as glaives in how you would play them in a Navigator build, except kinda just shittier, I think. Certain things like melee influence and the wacky crit scaling of Piercing Navigator kind of enable glaives to be pretty strong, albeit a little boring in Navigator. Explosive weapons don't really have that. As a rule of thumb, if its punch through is locked at 0, don't bother. At this point, I'm just going to kind of rapid fire off a bunch of different weapons that don't really fall into these categories and why they're not good in Navigator. Just so people don't ask me, oh hey, have you tried this weapon, have you tried that weapon? Trust me, I believe I've tried just about all of them. Anyways, Dread and Paris and Carnon can't hit the same enemy twice. Tenet Agendis, Chlorophyll, can't hit the same enemy twice. Aram Spinoza and Quasis, too much multi-shot, not enough damage. Also very limited punch through. Sigma, Noctantis, and Cobra and Crane. Bad damage in the projectile. Lanka, Siam, Aeolak, Quelor. Just completely uncontrollable. Argo and Vel can only hit a limited amount of enemies. Alternox, this thing sucks. Tord and Azima, it only counts as a projectile in its non-active state, meaning once it starts doing damage, it is no longer viable as a projectile and cannot be navigated. Fulmin, Flashbang, Stug, you're not funny for suggesting this. Surging Aqua Blades. This one just really hurts me. I really wish you could navigate this. I feel like with the damage buildup, it could be a really interesting and fun playstyle. And like, clearly that's a projectile, right? Like, I'm not insane. But no, Navigator doesn't even activate on this. Coil Horizon. This one I understand why it doesn't work. I just think it'd be cool if you could pilot this around like Grendel's Pulverize. I think that would be neat. Pretty much any Helminth ability, none of them just do enough scaling damage to work in Navigator, unfortunately. And with that, I've covered, I think, everything. Doesn't really leave you with many options, huh? Unfortunately, Navigator is kind of hyper-specified in what weapons it can use. Sometimes I wish Navigator just worked a little bit differently, so Ivara could have more weapon variety. Which brings us into our next segment. Does Ivara need a rework? The short answer is yes.
Asterisk.
What Ivara needs is a Pablo-certified light rework. Something like what Nova got. The last thing I want to see is one of Ivara's major abilities getting removed. So what do I think a rework like this would entail? As Ivara's greatest soldier, let me put a few ideas out there, starting with Quiver. I think we've all been thinking it. I think we all know it. Noise has to go. Noise is just terrible. I didn't really give the rundown of what the ability actually does earlier because it's so bad. Like, yes, the range is good. I've tried to think of scenarios where this is like a good option to use, but the problem is it feels like most enemies under the effect of Noise Arrow choose deliberately to use their slowest possible walking animation. And when you're invisible, what's the point of Noise Arrow? You're Ivara, the invisible frame. And in case Noise wasn't enough, you also have Sleep Arrow. Because it's not enough to be invisible, the enemy needs to be asleep too. Now Cloak Arrow is only kind of getting a pass from me, not because I think it's any bit useful on Ivara, but because in the Helminth ability, some people I know swear by the ability to shoot your sentinel with a cloak arrow and be invisible. But I also partially don't like this, because this is kind of a PC-only thing. Console players are completely unable to use this feature. My suggestion for a Quiver rework is to make it all team buffs, sort of change Cloak to be more similar to Titania's Spellbind. You can cast it on allies, or you can cast it at the ground to cast it on yourself. I didn't mention Dashwire because keep Dashwire exactly the same as it is. That is a wonderful, wonderful ability, and it is so unique, so perfect. I'm going to give it a kiss. Okay, Navigator, the big boy. I don't think Navigator needs that many changes, but I think the changes that it could get would propel it into being one of the best abilities in the game, undeniably. First change. Remember when I mentioned doors earlier? Here's where the door rant begins. This ability makes me hate doors. If you're in a tile set with a door, you're just locked from doing like half the fucking mission. You need to stay in one room because doors will not open for your navigated projectile. You have to wait for an ally or an enemy to open those doors. That's really, really annoying and is the one thing holding this ability back from being usable outside of just stay in one room missions. If they just added a property to your navigated projectile that 1. Made it open doors, 2. Caused the map to follow it, and 3. Periodically refresh the status of the projectile so it can hit the same enemy multiple times, that would be fantastic. Absolute 9.9 out of 10 ability. But there's one more change that I want to suggest to make the ability even better. I want Ivara to be more mobile. But how do I want to accomplish that? I love Ivara's slow and methodical gameplay. How do I make that more mobile? My suggestion, and it's a pretty good one if I say so myself, give Navigator a tap and hold function that allows you to teleport to your active projectile, consuming the projectile and allowing Ivara to maintain the momentum of said projectile once she teleports to it. This could become one of the most fun navigation abilities in the game. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Navigator? Navigation ability? I think it'd be cool. As for Piercing Navigator, this augment needs a little bit of help. This augment completely fails in the way of giving more viability to weapons that were previously not good with Navigator. I think instead of giving a small, measly amount of punch through, I think, and bear with me here, I think this should give infinite body punch through. Now, what I mean by this is punch through that only applies to hitting enemies and not to walls. My biggest concern with my idea for being able to teleport to a projectile is things like the Fluctus that would just be easy, game-breaking combo, but I'm sure there would be a workaround to that. But as for the infinite body punch through, here's why I think that's not overpowered. One, it's only active while you're in Navigator. And two, let's be completely honest here. Will that even change what's the most viable projectile for Navigator? All it will do is give other projectiles a fighting chance. When you look at all of the top projectile weapons in the game, what do you see? You see two types of weapons. Weapons that are explosive and therefore cannot be given punch through at all, which would not work with the augment, and you see weapons that already have infinite punch through. I can't think of a single meta projectile weapon that does not fall into one of those two categories. When you look at what options we have available already, giving infinite punch through to your Quasis or your fucking, I don't know, your Cernos Prime arrow, that doesn't sound that overpowered now, does it? I think even a couple of these changes to Navigator could propel it to being undeniably one of the best abilities in the game, but if you disagree, let me know what you think. I'm not above baiting interaction in the comments. I don't know how the algorithm works, I just know it likes when you do that. Anyways, Prowl. Prowl doesn't need many changes. I think they should stick with the idea of, oh, you're slowly stalking and prowling, but at this point, sprinting is kind of the same thing as slowly prowling in Warframe. I genuinely think the only thing they should change about Prowl is just let you sprint in it. Like, yes, I still think you shouldn't be allowed to bullet jump. It shouldn't just be like free invisibility and giga headshot multiplier. IVARA'S passive, I think she should just keep the one she has now. It's a really, really good passive. I think if they make the change to Navigator that allows it to have the map follow it, I think that would be a really good passive along with it. So just keep her enemy radar. And that's my idea for an IVARA rework. If you've made it this far in the video, let me know what you think. I think personally that would make IVARA way more fun, way more interesting, usable in a lot more different mission types. I think it makes her good without sort of killing her current identity. She doesn't need to do more damage in terms of Navigator at all. I think Artemis Bow could use slightly higher stats, but not by that much. I think the problem with exalted weapons will still be present no matter how big the stats get. It's just not being able to use... Okay, no, make it use Argon Scope. That's all I care about. Make it use Argon Scope, please. I'd like Arcanes on exalted weapons too, but just please Argon Scope. Now, rework aside, I actually wanted to report some really annoying bugs real quick. I already mentioned getting kicked out of Navigator when you hit a Void proc, but it feels like the amount of things that kick you out of Navigator has been growing lately. One really annoying example is just most Scaldra enemies. If you dare touch a Dedicant with your zenistar, you're just out of Navigator. If you hit the little weak point on the back of a Jaeger, you're kicked out of Navigator. Sometimes Babaus kick you out of Navigator. It's just so many Holvania enemies just kick you out. It's incredibly frustrating. I'm probably going to drop a forum post on it as well. I would really like this to be fixed. Another bug I'm going to talk about, which you might have saw earlier in the video, there's actually a bug that allows you to shoot the weapon in your hand in Navigator. If you remember that clip from earlier where I'm using the zenistar and a bunch of slash procs show up on that enemy, that's because I had the route equipped. I was able to shoot it while I was in Navigator, which is just, just awful. Totally not how the game was intended to be played. And that's why I'm doing my due diligence of reporting it. But if DE wanted to take their time on fixing it, I'd completely understand. I mean, it'll probably take so much effort trying to fix the whole getting kicked out of the Navigator zenistar build bug, so, they can put this one on the back burner if they'd like to. And with that, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about. If anyone is watching this far, I do sincerely thank you. I don't know how this video is going to be received. I went into this having no experience with making videos, no experience editing, recording, even making animation. That animation at the beginning of the video took way longer than I'd like to admit. Warframe is my favorite game of all time, so if people like this video, even if they don't, to be honest, I hope I can keep making videos. I really liked making this one. It was a pretty big commitment, took a lot of time, but my next videos are probably going to be closer to 10 minutes. The main reason I made this video is just I had an overwhelming urge to spread Ivara propaganda. If you couldn't tell, Ivara is my favorite Warframe, and I'm kinda sick of people calling her bad. And for a while now, I've heard people calling my favorite ability, Navigator, a free subsume slot. It feels as though the average player just doesn't know how to play Ivara, and I wanted to take it upon myself to try and change that. Not to say that I'm necessarily the arbiter of truth for Ivara-related builds, but I have this urge to be like the YouTube Ivara guy. So if there are any inaccuracies in my video, any alternate Ivara builds I could learn about, please let me know. And with that, our time was swell, but I must go. I'll never forget you. Farewell.
So long.